Story 1. I've worked homicide in Pima County long enough to think I've seen it all, but I still can't shake that call from a couple years back. I live out in Vail, about 20 minutes from Tucson, a quiet place with dry winds and coyotes that sound like kids screaming in the washes at night. You get used to it, but that night it was dead quiet, and it's the silence I remember the most. I wasn't even a detective then, just patrol. I'd pulled a double because some rookie called out, and I was getting ready to wrap up when dispatch called in a welfare check off Old Spanish Trail. They said the neighbor finally got around to calling because the guy's mailbox was stuffed, and he hadn't seen him in a while. Nobody really knew how long that was, out there where the neighbors are a quarter-mile apart. It was around 10 p.m. when I rolled up, gravel crunching under the tires. I cut the engine, and everything went black except my flashlight beam sweeping across the dirt yard. The place didn't look abandoned, just tired. Paint peeling, but the windows were intact, shades pulled, mailbox practically throwing up envelopes, some with pink and yellow notices. I walked around back, smelled something sour under the breeze, and saw flies thick on the glass of the sliding door. I got that itch between my shoulder blades I only get when something's off. You know the one. I knocked, called out, nothing. My backup arrived, and we popped the lock. You ever smelled death that's been sitting for months? It's like wet pennies and rotten meat, but sweeter somehow. It stuck in my nose and behind my teeth, and I could taste it when I swallowed. We stepped in slow, clearing rooms, but the house was quiet. Really quiet. The guy was in the dining room, slumped over on the floor with the old-style phone cord tangled around his arm, the chair tipped over behind him. He was half melted into the carpet, skin dark and glossy, clothes still on him but stuck to the floor. He still looked like a man, but not really. More like a deflated thing that used to be alive. I stood there frozen because I saw his hand still gripping the phone. It was off the hook, resting in a puddle that had dried up around it. My partner was gagging behind me, but I couldn't take my eyes off that phone. It was like he was trying to call for help but never finished dialing. The place was tidy. That's what messed with me the most. 2 grocery bags on the kitchen floor, canned stuff, some bread that had turned to green dust. The counters were clean, dishes done. Nothing was knocked over except that one chair, like he'd just come home, put the groceries down, felt his chest seize, and grabbed the phone. I kept thinking about how long it must have taken him to fall. If he was conscious, how long he lay there waiting for someone to find him. But the real thing that's never left me, what still wakes me up sometimes, was what we found in the basement. The pipes had burst, probably during a freeze, and the floor was covered in a couple inches of stagnant water, black with mold and dead flies floating on top. The air was heavy, and my flashlight beam bounced off the water, showing shapes under the surface. At first I thought it was debris, then I saw the cat, or what was left of it. It was bloated, fur slipping off, floating near the stairs, and its mouth was open like it had been meowing when it died. I don't know why it broke me, but it did. I thought about how it probably stayed by him upstairs, waiting, maybe trying to wake him, before it got hungry enough to go looking for water. It found the basement, fell in, and couldn't get out. The coroner later said the man died of a massive heart attack. They figured he'd been dead for nearly 8 months before the neighbor noticed the mailbox. 8 months of him lying there, season after season, windows baking in the sun, flies hatching and dying again and again around him. We cleared out after the coroner arrived, and the house felt different then, like whatever had been hanging in the air left with the body. But before I stepped out, I turned back and looked at the phone on the floor. The dial tone was still droning softly from it, like a faint whine echoing in the empty house. I don't know why, but I picked it up and hung it up. The sound cut off, and the silence that replaced it was so complete, it was like the air got sucked out of the room. I still think about that moment, about how he died trying to call for help, groceries still in the bag, the cat waiting until it starved, and no one noticing. That house sat there, holding death inside it, while the world just kept moving on outside. Bills piling up, seasons changing, birds nesting in the eaves, and him just lying there waiting for someone to find him. Sometimes when I drive past that road at night, I catch myself looking for that house in the dark, even though it's long been cleared out and sold to someone else. I wonder if they ever hear the faint tone of a phone in the dark, whining softly in the empty spaces at night, reminding them of what that place held on to for so long. That's the worst part about this job. It's not the gore or the smell, it's the silence afterward, The empty rooms where something terrible happened, and the feeling that the air still remembers. I transferred out of patrol not long after that, moved up to detective. I've worked homicides that would turn your stomach, seen what people do to each other for money, drugs, or nothing at all. But nothing has ever creeped me out the way that call did. Because it wasn't murder, or evil, or rage. It was just a man dying alone, unnoticed, the world going on without him, until the smell finally forced someone to care. Story 2. It started with a call that didn't sound all that unusual. At first, a woman living in an apartment building near the outskirts of town had phoned in, claiming she was being watched by ghosts. Dispatch passed the information along to me and my partner with a shrug. "She's schizophrenic," they'd said. "Just do a wellness check and report back." Wellness checks were routine enough. Most of the time, it was just about reassuring someone, helping them feel safe in their home. But this one? It quickly became clear that it wasn't going to be the ordinary kind of call. The apartment complex was tucked away behind a stretch of old industrial buildings and crumbling parking lots, the kind of place you don't notice unless you're actively looking for it. And next door, an abandoned funeral home, its once elegant facade now peeling and covered in graffiti. It was the kind of building kids dared each other to break into, complete with broken windows and overgrown weeds wrapping around the base like the hands of time pulling it under. We knocked on the woman's door, and she answered almost immediately. She was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with messy hair and tired eyes that darted around nervously. Her first words? "They're watching me. I can feel them." We stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and old coffee. She led us to her living room, her hands shaking as she waved toward the window. "They're in there," she said, pointing at the funeral home next door. "I see them sometimes. Shadows, faces. They're keeping track of everything." I glanced at my partner, trying to mask my skepticism. "Do you think these are people?" I asked carefully. "No," she snapped, her voice sharp and certain. "They're not people. They're spirits, watching me, watching all of us." She gestured wildly at a notepad on the table, where she'd written her observations, scribbled notes about seeing movement at odd hours, hearing faint noises, and sensing that she wasn't alone. On the surface, it looked like the ramblings of someone caught in paranoia, but something about the way she described it, I don't know. It felt too deliberate, too detailed. We did a sweep of her apartment. Everything was in order, aside from her pile of notes and a few newspapers she'd used to black out the windows. But as we stood there, listening to her explain how she felt their eyes on her, I couldn't help but glance out the window at the darkened, yawning shell of the funeral home. My partner spoke first. "Let's take a look outside," he said, his tone more amused than concerned. He clearly thought it was all nonsense, but I wasn't as sure. Something about the whole setup didn't sit right with me. We made our way around the side of the apartment building, flashlights cutting through the shadows. The funeral home loomed ahead, its broken windows glinting faintly in the moonlight. The air felt colder there, sharper, as if it carried something the wind couldn't quite sweep away. And that's when we found it. There was a small side entrance to the funeral home, partially boarded up. The boards had been pried loose, just enough for someone to slip through. Inside, the air was stale and thick with decay, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered. My partner went in first, and I followed reluctantly. The place was a mess. Broken furniture, debris scattered across the floor, old mortuary equipment gathering dust in the corners. It was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find graffiti and maybe even squatters. But it was what we found upstairs that changed everything. In one of the old offices, we found a desk covered in notebooks. They weren't old or forgotten. They were recent, their pages filled with crude, handwritten logs. There were dates, times, and descriptions. Woman in apartment 3C leaves for work at 8:15 a.m. Man in 4A comes home at 6:30 p.m. Page after page chronicling the movements of the residents in the apartment building next door. My partner's face shifted, the humor draining from it. "This isn't," he started, trailing off as he flipped through another notebook. The logs weren't just detailed, they were obsessive. Whoever had written them had clearly spent hours, maybe days, watching the building. There were other things too. A pair of binoculars sitting on the windowsill, facing the woman's apartment. Wrappers from protein bars, half a bottle of water, the kinds of things someone would bring if they were camping out for long stretches of time. The woman wasn't wrong about being watched. She'd just been right in a way none of us expected. We called it in, getting more officers and investigators on the scene. By the time we returned with a full team, though, the place was empty. Whoever had been there must have seen us coming or realized they'd been found out. They were gone, leaving only the notes and a few scattered belongings behind. The woman wasn't wrong. Someone, something, had been watching her, keeping track of her, of everyone. Why? We never found out. The investigators never uncovered who had been using the funeral home or what their intentions were. My partner theorized they'd been planning some kind of crime, but fled when they thought they'd been discovered. To this day, I still think about those logs, about the eerie accuracy of the descriptions, the way they mirrored her paranoia almost perfectly, and about the fact that we might never know what they were really planning. Story 3. Investigating insurance claims wasn't a glamorous job, but it certainly had its moments of intrigue, and occasionally moments of creeping dread. One of those moments happened during an arson case I worked on years ago in Birmingham, Alabama. The fire had taken place in the historic Masonic Temple, a towering 8-story Renaissance Revival building nestled in the historic Black business district downtown. It wasn't just the fire itself that was unsettling. It was what I found while combing through the charred remains. Built in the 1920s, the Masonic Temple was a monument to an era when Black entrepreneurs and professionals thrived in the area. The massive marble lobby and its grand second-floor ballroom had seen countless celebrations, fundraisers, and important gatherings over the decades. The building also housed offices for Black-owned businesses, from tailors to attorneys to the local NAACP chapter. But as the decades passed and integration came, the neighborhood experienced white flight, businesses moved out or shuttered altogether, and the building began its slow decline into emptiness. By the time I arrived, it was mostly abandoned, aside from the still-functioning masons and, apparently, squatters who'd sparked the fire. When I got the call to investigate, I didn't know much beyond the basics. Determine the cause of the fire, assess the damage, and see how far the destruction had spread. What I wasn't prepared for was the eerie silence that hung over the building. The electricity had been shut off by the fire department as a safety precaution, leaving the interior cloaked in darkness. It was up to me and my flashlight to navigate the sprawling structure. The second floor, the grand ballroom, had miraculously escaped damage. Walking into it felt like stepping back in time. The intricate millwork, elegant decor, and massive chandeliers were untouched, waiting patiently for a party that would never come. I took a moment to admire its grandeur before pressing on to the third floor. The offices on the third floor were mostly intact, still holding on to their mid-century furniture, some of which was in pristine condition. I came across desks layered with dust, filing cabinets left frozen in time, and the remnants of lives once busy with work and ambition. But as I climbed higher, something shifted. The building grew darker, literally and figuratively. The fourth floor was the first to make me hesitate. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom as I moved down narrow hallways, sweeping the beam across abandoned rooms. In one office, I found an old NAACP space, perfectly preserved as though someone had locked the door and left decades ago. Papers and files lined the drawers, untouched, waiting. I lingered for a moment before venturing down the hall, my nerves buzzing. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, obscured by shadows, was a large looming structure. My flashlight barely illuminated it, just enough to make out its shape. Slowly, cautiously, I moved closer, my heart pounding with each step. Finally, the light revealed it fully. A coffin, an old Dracula-style coffin, standing upright at the end of the hall. I froze. My brain scrambled to rationalize its presence. Why would a coffin be here, in the middle of an empty office? I didn't dare touch it, didn't even want to get close enough to examine it. I backed away, keeping my eyes on it, and hurried to the stairwell. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just some strange remnant of a time long past. I kept climbing, floor after floor, and with each level the building felt heavier. The halls grew darker, the air colder, the sense of unease more intense. And the coffins? They weren't limited to the fourth floor. I found more. Some were out in the open, standing like monuments in the middle of offices. Others were tucked into closets or wedged against doors, blocking them from the inside. Every time I encountered one, I felt that same rush of unease, that same instinct telling me to keep moving. When I reached the top floor, the mystery became clearer and creepier. The two remaining businesses were revealed in faded signage, a coffin company and the Order of the Eastern Star. The OES Lodge gave me chills before I even entered its hallway. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I took a few quick pictures of the space before bolting back to the stairwell. By the time I reached the lobby, my nerves were shot. The only area left to inspect was the basement, a decision I didn't make lightly. But as I descended the stairs, I found something unexpected: a fallout shelter. Hundreds of barrels of water, food, medical supplies, radiation detectors, and more lined the space, perfectly preserved. It was a time capsule of a different era, tucked away in the darkness beneath the building. When I left the Masonic temple, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that didn't want to be disturbed. The building was more than just a relic of history. It was a place where time had frozen, holding on to secrets and shadows that didn't belong to me. That investigation stuck with me long after the paperwork was done. The fire may have brought me there, but it was the silence and the strangeness of the temple itself that lingered. Some places carry a weight that doesn't fade, and the Masonic Temple in Birmingham is one of them. Story 4. I'm a detective out of Allegheny County, just east of Pittsburgh, and I've seen enough messed up scenes to last 3 lifetimes. But there was one job back in 2017 that still makes me sweat when I think about it. And I don't even tell the story often because people don't believe it, and I get it because I wouldn't either. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, raining steady but not heavy, just enough to keep the roads slick. I was living alone in a basement apartment off Braddock Avenue, and I was on call that week, which meant no sleep and cold coffee whenever the phone rang. My partner Ray called me up, said we had a situation on 8th Street, an abandoned duplex. Neighbors complained about screaming a couple nights in a row, and someone thought they saw a light moving around in the basement. I didn't want to go, to be honest. The address was tied to a crew we'd been watching, guys who moved low-level stuff, some stolen guns, some pills, but nothing too heavy. Still, we needed to check it out, so I grabbed my rain jacket and met Ray out front. The place was quiet when we pulled up, except for the rain hitting the gutters and the wind knocking a plastic bag down the sidewalk. It was one of those houses you see in these dying neighborhoods, windows covered in plywood, the porch sagging like it wanted to give up. There was a for sale sign half ripped out of the ground. Nothing felt right about it, and I could tell Ray felt the same because he was doing that thing where he tapped the butt of his flashlight on his leg over and over. "Ready?" he said. "Yeah, let's do it." We didn't expect to find much. Maybe a squatter, maybe some kid trying to scare his friends. But as soon as we got up to the door, we both smelled it. You can't mistake that smell once you've smelled it. A thick, wet rot that sticks to your clothes and your hair. I pulled my shirt over my nose and Ray used the butt of his flashlight to push the door open. We stepped in, flashlights cutting across empty beer cans, a stained mattress on the floor, graffiti on the walls. It felt like the air was heavy, like something didn't want us there. And I told myself it was just the mold, just the garbage, just my own damn nerves. "Check the basement?" Ray asked. I didn't answer. I just pointed my light at the basement door, which was shut tight with a padlock, a thick chain wrapped around it. There were scratches all over the door, deep and deliberate, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Ray went quiet, and we just stood there for a second, listening. I swear to God I heard something move on the other side of that door, a dragging sound, soft and slow, like something wet was pulling itself across the concrete floor. Ray looked at me, waiting for me to say it, so I did. "We're cutting it." We got the bolt cutters from the car, and I'll never forget how loud the chain sounded when it dropped to the ground, how it echoed in the empty house. We pushed the door open, and the smell that hit us was worse than anything I'd smelled before. Ray gagged, turned his head, but I forced myself to look down the stairs. The basement was dark, our lights barely reaching the bottom, but what we could see was water, maybe ankle deep, black and rippling, even though there was no draft, no movement, nothing that should have made it move. There were shapes in the water, bags maybe, or blankets, floating and shifting. We stood there, and then something under that water moved, pushing the floating bags aside, and we both stepped back. It was big, whatever it was, and it made this sound, this low, bubbling groan that came from everywhere and nowhere. I pointed my light, trying to catch a clear look, and the beam caught something pale, human-colored, floating face down, hair drifting like seaweed. Ray whispered, "Jesus Christ." That's when it moved. The body, or what I thought was a body, lifted its head. It wasn't a body. It was something else, something pale and raw, like a person with no skin, its eyes black and sunk into its skull, its mouth hanging open like it was trying to scream but couldn't. It started crawling, dragging itself through the water toward the stairs, its arms making that wet, slapping sound. I heard myself say, "Back up," but my feet wouldn't move, and Ray grabbed my arm, pulling me, and the thing was already halfway up the stairs, leaving streaks of black water on the steps. It opened its mouth wider, and this sound came out, a rattling, hollow screech that made my teeth hurt. Ray pulled me harder, and I snapped out of it. We ran out of that house, out into the rain, and didn't stop until we were back at the cars, breathing hard, soaking wet, shaking. We called it in, told dispatch there was a body in the basement, told them to send the coroner, animal control, whoever. We didn't know what else to say. When backup arrived, we went back in, guns drawn this time, but the basement was empty. No water, no body, just a damp concrete floor and the stink of rot. The scratches were still on the stairs, dark and fresh, but whatever we saw was gone, like it had never been there. The coroner didn't find a body. They found bones, old, brittle, scattered in the corners, like something had been picking at them. We bagged them up, took them in, but there was no ID, no way to know who they were. We asked around, but nobody in the neighborhood knew anything, or if they did, they weren't saying. Ray and I didn't talk much about what we saw. We wrote it up as a recovery of remains in a known drug property, noted the scratches, noted the smell, but left out the part about what we saw crawl up those stairs. You can't put that in a report. Nobody would believe it, and honestly, I barely believe it myself. Story 5. I don't think I'll ever forget that apartment, or the way the steam clung to my skin as we stood there, trying not to gag. I'm Marcus, by the way. I live just outside Cleveland, been a detective here for nearly a decade. Most days are dull paperwork and chasing down stolen cars. But sometimes you walk into a place that shifts something inside you permanently. This was one of those days. It was a Tuesday morning, cold as hell, when dispatch told me to meet patrol at a welfare check. The neighbor had complained about a steady drip coming through her ceiling, and the smell was getting to her. She thought the tenant upstairs was dead. That's the kind of call you get used to. Old people die alone. The heat's on, you get decomposition. It's sad, but you learn to handle it. I pulled up to a brown brick complex, walked up the salt-scattered stairs and nodded to the uniform at the door. He was pale. "What's the story?" I asked. "Water's been leaking for 2 days," he said. "No answer. Landlord's here." They forced the door open, and that's when the heat hit me first, like walking into a sauna that smelled like rotting meat. I've smelled death before, but it's the wet smell that gets you, thick and sweet, clinging to your nostrils. The living room was normal. TV on, static playing, couch with a blanket thrown over it. The smell was stronger down the hall. We followed it, careful with our steps, and found the bathroom door closed. You could see steam puffing from underneath, like the room was breathing. I pulled my glove tighter, opened the door, and the cloud of heat and stench rolled out, hitting us in the face so hard the rookie behind me gagged immediately. I've seen suicides, overdoses, gunshots. I've never seen this. The guy was in the tub, water still running, scalding hot, steam rising off the surface. His head was slumped forward, chin to chest, arms floating. His skin looked like wet paper, sliding off in sheets, exposing this pink-red mush beneath. The water was the color of weak tea, swirled with floating pieces of skin. We couldn't even turn off the water at first. The faucet was too hot to touch, and the steam made it feel like the whole room was alive, breathing around us. The landlord was behind us, mumbling prayers, while the rookie kept swallowing hard, trying not to throw up. It didn't look like murder. No bruises, no cuts, no blood on the floor. The guy's clothes were in a pile by the door, and there was an empty whiskey bottle on the sink. Looked like he came home drunk and decided to take a hot bath. But the knob for the cold water was broken off. Only the hot water was running, blasting into that tub nonstop. And there was a note on the counter, but it wasn't a suicide note. It was a shopping list, some frozen meals, and a six-pack. Nothing about wanting to die. We had to wait for the coroner to come, and that wait was the worst part. We stood in that hallway, door propped open, steam billowing out, the smell seeping into our clothes and skin. I watched the water drip down the guy's bloated arm, skin peeling off in long ribbons, dropping into the tea-colored water. You could hear it, like a quiet plop every time another piece let go. "Marcus," the rookie said, voice shaking, "why didn't he get out?" And that's what I've asked myself 100 times since. Why didn't he get out? The water must have been scalding. Your body would try to get out, even drunk, even passed out. You'd flinch, you'd move, something. But this guy sat there cooking. The coroner's team came, suited up, and I warned them the skin was coming off easily. They didn't believe me until they tried to lift him, and a whole layer slid right off, leaving them standing there holding what looked like a pale, empty suit. The worst sound was the water sloshing as they moved him, skin ribbons floating around, the tub draining out pieces of him. We bagged what we could, but the smell stayed on me for days. I could taste it in the back of my throat. I threw out the clothes I wore that day. The kicker? I had to call his next of kin, a sister in Pittsburgh. She hadn't heard from him in months. She just kept saying, "Are you sure it's him? Are you sure?" Over and over until I finally said, "Yes, ma'am," because I didn't know what else to say. For weeks, I found myself staring at the tub in my own place, testing the water temperature before getting in, checking the cold knob 3 or 4 times. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it would be for something so simple, so stupid to end you like that. Boiling alive in your own bathroom, nobody even realizing until you started dripping through the ceiling below. I've worked bigger cases since, more violent ones, but nothing has ever stuck with me like that scene. The heat, the smell, the steam, and that body slumped forward as if he'd just nodded off, the water quietly turning him into soup. It was the most horrifying thing I've seen, not because it was a murder or a monster or a ghost, but because it was just him, alone, unnoticed, slowly cooking while the world outside kept moving, nobody caring until the stink got too strong. Story 6. The 1990s were an interesting time for technology. Back then, memory wasn't something you just popped into a cart and bought without blinking at the price. RAM sticks, those little pieces of hardware that powered everything in a computer, were absurdly expensive, running about $50 to $75 per megabyte. People think storage is precious now, but back then, every single megabyte mattered, which is why the theft I ended up involved in still baffles me to this day. I wasn't a detective. I was the tech guy they called when they didn't understand something about computers or needed help piecing things together in an investigation. My job wasn't glamorous, but it let me get my hands on cases that most people never even knew about. This one, though, this one was strange. I got the call from a friend in law enforcement one afternoon. They needed someone with a decent understanding of computer systems for a weird case involving a local university's lab. "Weird in what way?" I asked. He sighed and said, "You'll see." That was all the introduction I got before I showed up at the scene. The computer lab wasn't anything fancy, just a long room filled with bulky desktop computers, all humming away under the glare of fluorescent lights. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and dusty books, the kind of environment you'd expect to find in the corner of a university library. Nothing seemed amiss at first glance, but when the lead officer walked me through what had happened, I started to see why they called me in. Apparently, someone had broken into the lab over the course of several months, and systematically tampered with the machines. The thief hadn't stolen monitors or keyboards or anything big and obvious. No, they'd opened up each computer, one by one, and swapped out its RAM sticks. For those unfamiliar, RAM is the short-term memory that computers rely on to function, and back then, it was incredibly valuable. Each machine originally had 4 megabyte RAM sticks installed, top of the line for that era, but whoever had done this replaced them with cheaper, lower capacity 1 megabyte sticks. Here's the kicker. No one noticed. You'd think a performance drop in a computer lab full of students would raise a red flag, right? But between the gradual decline in speed and the general tolerance of tech glitches back then, it flew under the radar. People just chalked up slower computers to buggy programs or outdated hardware. The theft went unnoticed until a routine maintenance check months later revealed the swap. The window for the crime was bafflingly broad. The university determined the tampering must have taken place sometime between September 1st and January 10th, a span of over 4 months. No one had reported anything unusual during that time, and the lab wasn't equipped with door keycard systems or cameras. Security, as it turned out, relied heavily on faith. The most unsettling detail was how methodical the thief had been. Opening up computers isn't a fast process, even less so in the 90s. It's not just popping a lid, It's screws, clips, cables, and careful maneuvering. To do this to a dozen machines without leaving any visible damage or arousing suspicion, that took patience, precision, and familiarity with the systems. As I examined the computers looking for any sign of fingerprints or leftover tools, something occurred to me. This wasn't about greed. RAM sticks were valuable, sure, but there were easier ways to make money if someone wanted to steal. No, this felt meticulous, like the person who did it was more interested in the act itself than the payout. We started digging deeper into who might have had access to the lab. Students, faculty, maintenance staff. It was a wide net to cast, especially with no suspects and no physical evidence. The lack of cameras meant we had no faces to match with the timeline. Even the act of breaking into the lab itself was a mystery. The doors were usually locked after hours, but there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever it was either had a key or had figured out a way to bypass the lock entirely. The scariest part was how anonymous it all felt. Technology leaves traces, IP addresses, keystrokes, access logs, but this person managed to move through the space like a ghost. They left no fingerprints, no footprints, no clues about who they were or why they did it. For all we knew, they could have been one of the students, sitting in class next to the very machines they'd tampered with. The investigation hit a wall fast. Without suspects, we had no one to question. Without footage or clear evidence, we couldn't pin down a motive. The stolen RAM sticks never resurfaced, and the replaced ones were generic enough that they could have come from anywhere. The trail was cold before it even started. We ended up filing the case as unsolved, though the university beefed up its security after that. They installed cameras and keycard systems, too late to catch the original thief, but enough to deter copycats. The lab went back to business as usual, and the slow computers were gradually upgraded, erasing the remnants of the crime altogether. But I never stopped thinking about it, not just because of how bizarre it was, but because of what it represented. How easy it is for someone to slip through the cracks, to manipulate a system without leaving a trace. Whoever did this wasn't just good at what they did. They were patient, deliberate, and maybe even a little obsessive. Story 7. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it was over 5 years ago. I was on duty, manning the TAC radio in Broward County at around 3 a.m. The humid Florida air did little to warm the deserted stretch of highway where we eventually received the call. It wasn't uncommon for our shifts to be quiet, but that night, something played on my nerves from the very start. I was sitting in the sweltering pre-dawn darkness when the dispatch crackled over the radio. Unit 12, respond to a multiple vehicle collision on I-95 near exit 37. Reports indicate an 18-wheeler struck a box truck as it was coming off the exit. Over. The message came through cool and clinical, yet I could feel my pulse begin to quicken. We'd heard about plenty of accidents on that highway before, but the specifics had a grim tone I couldn't ignore. I activated my lights and sped toward the scene. The highway was barren, the only sounds the low rumble of my cruiser and the intermittent chirp of the radio. As soon as I arrived, I knew something wasn't quite right. The wreckage was far worse than a run-of-the-mill collision. An 18-wheeler had slammed into a box truck with such force that it chopped the smaller vehicle in half. Flames were licking at the twisted metal and shattered glass, and the roar of the burning truck fractured the eerie silence. Officers, firefighters, and units from 3 different jurisdictions were already arriving. I parked my cruiser alongside the chaotic scene, stepping out into the acrid stench of burning rubber and spilling diesel. My flashlight and badge in hand, I approached one of the on-scene officers who was coordinating the rescue efforts. "What's the status?" I asked. The officer's face was grim. "We've got 3 people trapped inside that truck, sir. It nearly exploded when the impact hit. They're in there, caught by the wreckage, and the fire's closing in." I could see the fear in his eyes even as he tried to remain calm. That's when the call came through on the radio, a frantic plea from one of the units. Rescue personnel had just reported a witness account. A man had been seen at the scene, a quiet figure who helped extricate the victims from the burning vehicle. According to the witness statements, the injured passengers were in dire need of help. One of them described being dragged from the wreckage by a man in plain clothes. They said he had pulled them from the inferno, gently laying them on the side of the road on a strip of asphalt that still sizzled from the heat of the fire. The story was odd enough to be almost unbelievable, but with the stakes so high, every detail was crucial. As the chaos unfolded, units swarmed the scene. Firefighters battled the blaze, ambulances loomed with their sirens off, and police officers cordoned off the area. When the time came to check on every person involved in the accident, someone from the fire department, one of our more veteran firefighters, noticed something peculiar. I remember watching him as he grabbed the arm of the man who had rescued the occupants. He was about to ask for identification, maybe even a statement about how the rescue had happened, when the firefighter turned around. In that moment of split-second recognition, the man just vanished. I'll never forget the look on my colleague's face. His eyes widened, and he muttered something under his breath about not miffing with ghosts. A chill ran down my spine. We even dispatched additional units to scour the area for any sign of the rescuer, checking behind vehicles and along the roadside. But it was as if the man had never been there at all. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. I rounded on another officer. "Did anyone catch his description?" "What did he look like?" The officer replied, "He wasn't wearing a uniform or anything. Just plain clothes, and he seemed calm. The survivors say he guided them to safety, but when we tried to find him, he was gone. It's like he was just a spirit." I found myself questioning everything I'd seen in my years on the force. Broward County had its share of bizarre cases, but this defied logic. The notion that someone could appear, help 3 people out of a burning vehicle, and literally vanish into the night was something straight out of a ghost story. I kept replaying the radio calls and the frantic testimonies in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if we had just encountered something, or someone, that wasn't wholly of this world. At that moment, the entire crash scene became even more surreal. I recalled the expressions on the survivors' faces: relief, confusion, and an eerie calm as if they were in a daze. When later interrogated by our team, one of the survivors said, "He didn't say a word. I just felt safe with him there. He was there 1 minute and then he was gone." His voice trembled, but he insisted it was exactly as it happened. Throughout the day, while units processed the scene and collected evidence from the twisted metal and charred remains, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something larger was at play. The incident was logged as a vehicle fire with entrapment, a tragic accident that, by all accounts, should have been solved quickly by standard procedures. But that solitary phantom rescuer haunted my thoughts. I even went over our recordings multiple times, listening to every dispatch, every word. There was nothing to indicate any tampering or planted evidence. The only anomaly was the disappearance of that mysterious man. I spent the rest of the shift trying to piece together the timeline in my mind. I interviewed officers and firefighters, trying to see if any one of them might have seen him again or had a better description. But every conversation led back to the same chilling conclusion: he was never seen again after that moment. I remember one of the senior detectives from a neighboring jurisdiction remarking dryly, "That's the weirdest thing I've ever seen on a collision scene." It wasn't a compliment, but it summed up the mystery perfectly. Back at headquarters, when I recounted the story to a few colleagues, I expected reactions of shock or even horror. Instead, many of them offered a nonchalant shrug, as if ghost stories were common currency among detectives. One rookie even chuckled and said, "Maybe he was just a good Samaritan in disguise," while another muttered, "Yeah, sure, like a guardian angel or some crap." But deep down, I knew what I had seen, or at least what everyone present insisted they had seen. That eerie figure had helped save lives and then evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing but questions and an inexplicable chill. It was one of those cases that, while officially closed, continues to echo in your mind. Every time I pass by that stretch of highway on a quiet night or listen to attack radio's morse of emergency calls, I feel that same inexplicable shiver. And though the official paperwork is complete, and the files on that wreck have long since gathered dust, the memory of that night, the sound of flames, the screams of rescuers, and then that unexplainable disappearance remains vivid. Story 8. I remember that night like it was carved into my memory, a night when even the relentless cold of northern Canada couldn't freeze the terror that followed. I was on night shift in an isolated First Nations community up north, tasked with investigating what initially seemed like a routine domestic violence complaint. It was the middle of winter, so cold that the air itself felt like shards of glass, and my partner and I were dispatched on a tip-off based on a neighbor's report of a woman's scream. We had trudged through the biting wind, our breath visible in the frigid air, driving slowly along unmarked roads where houses were few and far between. On many reservations, the homes weren't numbered properly, which made pinpointing the exact location a challenge. Our radio crackled with static as we tried to get more details from the caller. but all we got was a terrified, halting description that left much to our imagination. All we knew was that there'd been a scream, and it seemed to come from somewhere along the line of a scattered row of dilapidated homes. After several minutes of aimless circling and strained discussions with our dispatcher, we finally heard an ear-splitting shriek that cut through the otherwise eerie silence. It was so raw and desperate that it froze us in our tracks. My partner's eyes met mine for a split second, a mix of shock and grim determination, and we headed straight toward the source. There, on a frostbitten stretch of the community, stood a single-story prefabricated home that looked like it had seen better days. The wooden siding was faded with age, and icicles clung like sinister ornaments to its eaves. The front door hung slightly ajar, a precarious gap that suggested someone or something had extricated itself from within. All the lights were off, and any hint of life that might have been there was cloaked in a darkness that matched the winter night. We hurried up to the door. "Police, open up!" I barked through the gap, pushing my voice hard against the wind. I knocked on the door repeatedly, and my partner echoed my cries. Again and again we called out. There was no response, just that unsettling, oppressive silence on the other side. The lack of any answer set us both on edge. If someone had truly been in distress, they'd have answered at least in a whisper. Fearing for whoever might be inside, we slowly eased the door open wider. I grabbed my flashlight, and with the officer's practiced caution, I announced, "Detectives here! Open up!" Into the opening. Still nothing. Heart pounding, I exchanged a brief nod with my partner, and together we stepped gingerly into the abandoned foyer. The interior was a disorganized chaos. Overturned trash bins, scattered remnants of old newspapers, and broken children's toys lay strewn across a floor that was as far from immaculate as the worst of crime scenes could be. The smell of damp decay mingled with a faint hint of something metallic, perhaps old blood or rust. Every step felt precarious, my eyes constantly darting around, half expecting to see the unthinkable. A body mangled and obscured beneath heaps of garbage. I couldn't shake the disquiet that maybe someone, or something, might have been hidden away in that mess. "Partner, be careful," I cautioned, my voice low and steady as we advanced further into the pitch-black dwelling. Our only sources of light were the harsh beams from our flashlights, which we swept methodically over the cluttered space. I first swept the beam to the left, where all I saw was more garbage and debris. Every step revealed nothing but decay, the collapsed remnants of a once lived-in home. Then I slowly panned my flashlight to the right. That's when I saw something white catch the beam's glare. I froze. In the distant gloom about 10 feet away amid the debris and discarded items stood a small figure. I squinted, heart pounding violently in my ears as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. The figure was that of a small girl, no older than 10, silhouetted against the darkness. She was wearing a white sleeping gown, the kind that looked like it belonged to another generation, long out of fashion since our grandmothers were young. The fabric was stained and worn, a snapshot of neglect and decay. Time seemed to suspend as I stared at her. Her head was slumped forward, and her greasy, unkempt hair was matted across her face, obscuring any features that might have offered an explanation. For a moment I thought of that horror flick, The Ring, and wondered if I'd just stepped into one of those cursed settings. I expected to see some electronic static or ominous background detail behind her, but all I saw was a shadowy figure standing amid refuse in the failing light of my flashlight. "Ma'am? Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing off the grimy walls. The sound startled me. The word "ma'am" seemed so out of place in the context of what I was witnessing. I took a slow step forward, trying to cover the distance between myself and this eerie apparition. The girl didn't react at first. She didn't move, nor did she speak. I could see her body swaying ever so slightly, as if caught in a weak breeze that had no place indoors. I raised my voice. "Hello? Are you okay?" My tone was louder now, carrying genuine concern mixed with a tremor I couldn't hide. Suddenly, as if roused by my approach, the girl jerked her head up abruptly. Her eyes, that momentary spark of life, locked onto mine. And then, without warning, she screamed. It was a piercing, gut-wrenching sound that seemed to come from deep somewhere. A scream that was more than just a child's cry. It was raw terror. I recoiled instinctively, the sound reverberating in my ears, while my partner stood frozen beside me, his face wan and unreadable. The scream filled the small, cluttered room, making the very walls seem to shake. I could feel the chill of it, an icy dread that seeped into my bones. After that agonizing moment, the girl's head slumped again, and she resumed her static, unnatural stance, as though the brief spark of recognition had been stolen away by the scream itself. "Did you see?" My partner mumbled, his words barely a whisper, as if afraid to break the oppressive silence that followed. I approached her carefully, my flashlight beam wavering slightly as I tried to focus on her face, hoping to see something, any sign of who she was or what might have happened to her. But even up close, her features remained shrouded in shadows and grime. She neither moved nor spoke. The horrifying glimpse of life in that dark room had already been etched into my mind with indelible clarity. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to speak again. "Hey, it's okay. We're here to help." I took another tentative step forward, but the girl simply stood still. Her eyes then closed again, offered no explanation, no understanding, merely a void of silence that deepened the mystery rather than alleviating it. Time slowed, and in that dismal interior, every second stretched into an eternity of unease. I was torn between my duty as a detective, my need to ensure the safety of someone who might be in peril, and the gnawing terror that what I was witnessing was beyond ordinary logic. With the stench of neglect and decay hanging heavily around us, I felt a deep, instinctive urge to retreat, but I couldn't just leave a screaming child, or whatever she might represent, in such dire straits. "Partner, should we?" I started, but I didn't finish the sentence. Her sudden, blood-curdling scream had already become more than enough to push any rational thought aside. The scream was genuine and paralyzing enough that it forced an immediate decision. We had to get out now. I stepped back abruptly, fumbling for my radio to call for backup, while my partner flinched as if even the slightest movement might wake something far worse. Our flashlights bobbed in the chaos as we retreated toward the door, the sound of that tortured scream echoing in our minds long after we crossed the threshold and closed the door behind us. Outside, the unforgiving winter wind seemed to mock the brevity of our encounter. The chill of that cold night could not compete with the lingering shock of what we had seen. A small girl, draped in a filthy, outdated sleeping gown, whose sudden outburst of terror shattered the silence of an already haunted, desolate home. We didn't speak much on the ride back to our patrol car. Words felt inadequate, nearly sacrilegious to the inexplicable horror of that moment. Story 9. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in haunted crap. Let's just get that straight. I've been a detective in Philly for over 15 years, seen plenty of drug busts, shootings, suicides. Bad stuff, sure, but explainable. So I'm not exactly eager to tell this, but it's the one call I still think about at night when the city's quiet, and it's like the dark is waiting to crawl inside. I was living in a row house off Girard, single, didn't even have a dog back then, working nights mostly. It was a Tuesday, mid-July, humid enough to choke you, and the air smelled like garbage and wet pavement. We got a call around 11:40 p.m. It came through as a wellness check. Dispatch said a neighbor called in about screaming and something about speaking in tongues. I rolled my eyes. Mental health calls, maybe a drug trip, maybe a domestic about to go bad. You learn to keep your guard up, but I didn't expect it to go sideways the way it did. The address was an old 3-story brick apartment building off 29th. Bad lighting, stairs that creaked, smells you don't want to think about. I was with my partner Diaz, who was new then, still trying to act tough but jumpy. We met the neighbor in the hallway, this older lady in a floral robe, shaking and whispering, "Something's wrong with him. He's talking to someone that isn't there." "Ma'am, stay in your apartment. We'll handle it," I told her, knocking on 3B. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. I glanced at Diaz, who was fidgeting, eyes darting down the hallway like he expected something to crawl out of the shadows. I felt it too, that heavy air that sometimes hangs before something bad happens. I called out, "Philly PD, we're coming in," and turned the knob. It was unlocked. The apartment was small, smelled like stale takeout and mildew. The lights were off except for the TV static flickering in the corner, throwing white flashes around the living room. I called out again, "Sir, you here?" That's when I saw him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, barefoot, wearing sweatpants and a dirty t-shirt, maybe late 40s, thin, pale, eyes like he hadn't slept in a week. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped me. It was the sound coming out of his mouth. At first, I thought he was having a seizure because his jaw was twitching, but then this low, rattling growl came out, layered, like there were two voices fighting to speak. I swear on my badge, it sounded like something was inside him, using his voice, but it wasn't him. Diaz whispered, "What the hell?" and took a step back. I kept my hand near my holster. "Sir, can you hear me? You need medical?" His head jerked and his eyes rolled, then snapped to me. His pupils were blown wide and he smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. "They're here," he croaked. "They're here for you." That voice wasn't right. It was deeper than it should have been, echoing in that tiny room, and I could feel it in my chest like bass from a subwoofer. He took one shaky step forward, and the temperature dropped, or maybe it was just me, but I felt cold sweat slide down my spine. "Sir, stay where you are," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He kept coming, slow, almost puppet-like, mouth twitching, whispering in that two-layered voice. "You hear them too, don't you?" That's when the TV behind us went black, like it died instantly, and the apartment fell silent. It was so quiet I could hear Diaz breathing hard behind me. I took another step back, hand fully on my gun now. "Stay back, sir." Then he screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was like every scream I'd ever heard layered into one, high-pitched and guttural at the same time, echoing against the bare walls. I felt it hit me in the chest, and for a second, I couldn't move. He dropped to the floor, thrashing, limbs hitting the tile, eyes rolled back, still screaming. I saw Diaz freeze, whispering, "Jesus, Jesus," under his breath. I wanted to move, to help, to do anything, but the scream kept going, stretching into something inhuman, and I felt like if I touched him, it would swallow me too. Then it stopped. Dead silence. His body went limp, face slack, eyes staring straight up, mouth open. I thought he was dead. I reached down, forcing myself to check his pulse, and his eyes snapped to mine, clear, terrified, whispering, "Help me." Before I could answer, he jerked back violently, eyes going blank, and let out a low hiss. Then, without warning, he stood up, quick, too quick, and bolted past us into the hallway. Diaz yelled and ran after him, but the man was fast, pounding down the stairs, bare feet slapping on the concrete. By the time we got to the street, he was gone. We checked alleys, corners, basements, nothing. We never found him. We ran his name, Thomas Keller, unemployed, history of depression, nothing else. His family said he was a quiet guy, kept to himself, no drugs, no drinking. He was reported missing. Case stayed open for a few months, then cold. No sightings, no credit card activity, nothing. Like he vanished into thin air. Sometimes I think about that scream, how it felt like it was tearing something out of the room. I think about how he looked at me, that one moment of pure terror, like he knew something was in there with him, and it was taking over. I still don't know what to call what happened that night. Was it mental illness? Drugs we didn't catch? Something else? All I know is that I've handled shootings, stabbings, overdoses, but nothing has stuck with me like that call. Story 10. I didn't sign up for ghost stories when I joined special investigations in Chicago, but sometimes you get handed a case that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the city. I've seen plenty of brutal crimes in Cheetown, murders that leave bodies nearly unrecognizable, robberies that baffle even the most seasoned detectives. But nothing prepared me for what we later dubbed the wolf killings. It all started with a series of grisly, wolf-like murders in neighborhoods that most folks wouldn't expect to see anything remotely supernatural. Victims, seemingly ordinary people with ties to various inner-city communities, were found savagely torn to pieces. At first, our division thought it was a street gang embracing a wolf motif, but the brutality and randomness of the killings defied any simple explanation. When we started cross-referencing the cases, a peculiar pattern emerged. Every victim had some connection, however slight, to an underground initiative known only as the Northwest Passage Project, a program spearheaded by a shadowy figure named McFinn. I remember the day we finally decided to pay McFinn a visit. We tracked him to a grim, nondescript building on the far side of town, a building that looked like it had been abandoned by time itself. I'd been working on these cases for years, and I'd learned not to get too comfortable with the gruesome details. But there was something about this project, the name, and the way it tied these murders together that set my skin on edge. My partner Ramirez and I, along with a couple of other guys from our unit, drove out to McFinn's place on a drizzly afternoon that felt as cold as winter in far northern Canada. We expected to find a hideout for some low-life cult or a place riddled with drugs and stolen goods. Instead, what we found was beyond anything I could have predicted. The building's exterior was unremarkable. A crumbling brick facade with boarded-up windows and a door that creaked open under the slightest pressure. We flanked it, guns drawn as we approached cautiously. I still recall the low murmur of boots on cracked concrete as we entered, our flashlights cutting weak beams through the musty dark. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of decay and something metallic I couldn't immediately place. "Keep your eyes peeled," Ramirez muttered as we crept into a narrow hallway. Our every step echoed in the silence until we came upon the evidence that would make this case so unforgettable. In one of the rooms, under a flickering fluorescent light, we found the body of a young girl sprawled in a shallow pool of coagulated blood. She was no older than 16, maybe even a bit younger, and her lifeless eyes stared blankly upward. What made it all the more disturbing was the condition of her throat. It wasn't just cut, it was completely torn out, a grisly wound that exposed her spine. I felt an immediate bone-deep revulsion, even as my training told me to compartmentalize the horror and get on with the investigation. "Jesus," one of my colleagues whispered. I didn't answer. Instead, I took careful photos, trying to capture every detail, knowing these images would haunt me long after the case was closed. As we combed through the building, every room seemed to reveal more evidence of a macabre obsession. In the upstairs corridor, we found ritualistic markings on the walls, symbols and weird glyphs that none of us could decipher. But it wasn't until we descended into the basement that things got downright surreal. The basement was a dark, cavernous space that reeked of damp earth and rust. In the center of the room, carved directly into the concrete floor, was a large circle inlaid with a design that looked impossibly ancient. The circle was about 8 feet in diameter, a perfect ring of intricately braided gold, bordered by mysterious symbols etched into the stone. There were gems inlaid with silver and hints of design that looked as if someone had painstakingly pried it from the very ground, only to remold it into something else entirely. The strange writing that punctuated the edges made my skin crawl. It wasn't in any language I recognized. I turned to Ramirez, who was standing a few feet away, his face lit by the stark beam of his flashlight. "You ever seen anything like this?" I asked quietly. He shook his head, his voice low. "Never. It looks like something out of a nightmare. I don't know whether it's meant to ward something in or keep something out." At that moment, we decided to call in our go-to occult specialist, a guy named Tucker, who'd helped us decode a couple of cases in the past that brushed against the paranormal. Tucker arrived later that day, his wiry frame and intense eyes belying a mind steeped in occult lore. After examining the circle, his expression shifted from curiosity to unease. "This ring," Tucker said slowly, running a trembling finger over the carvings. "It's not some ordinary ritual mark. It's designed to keep something locked in, specifically, werewolves." He paused for effect, and I could see our guys exchanging incredulous looks. I know it sounds insane, but everything about this setup, this material, the craftsmanship, the ancient script, it all points to techniques used in old folklore to contain shapeshifters. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Werewolves. In inner-city Chicago? It was ludicrous, right? And yet, the evidence didn't lie. The pattern of the murders, the ferocity of the attacks, and now this circle. It was all beginning to form a mosaic that defied everyday explanation. Before I could ask any more questions, Tucker continued, "McFinn's Northwest Passage project, it might be an attempt to study or control something best left unknown. Perhaps he's involved in experiments or rituals meant to harness or contain predators of a kind we've only heard of in legends." My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a cult? A twisted scientific study? Or had someone somehow summoned relics of ancient myth to wreak havoc on Chicago's streets? Back at headquarters, as we compiled our reports and handed over evidence to the forensic team, the case took an even darker turn. Over the next few weeks, more people showed up with deaths that bore the unmistakable signature of wolf-like violence. Attacks that left victims savage, their bodies torn apart in a manner that was more animalistic than human. Several of the suspects we eventually arrested were lowlifes with no connection to clandestine organizations. But the killings continued, and every time I looked at those grisly photos, I couldn't help but wonder, were those arrests ever really the full story? Or were we dealing with something far older and far more insidious than a mere gang war? There were nights I'd patrol the darker corridors of Chicago, and I'd catch my reflection in the grime of some abandoned building and think of that circle in the basement. The engraving meant to hold something in. Even as we tied up more cases and locked down a few individuals with tenuous ties to McFinn's operation, I'd find myself doubting whether we'd truly close the case. Because sometimes when the city sleeps and the wind howls like distant wolves, I remember Tucker's words. I remember the savage tears in a victim's flesh, the rituals scribbled on old walls, and that circle, a monstrous emblem of a fight waged between ancient powers and modern man. One frigid December evening, after another string of wolf murders in a rundown part of the city, I found myself in my office staring at that photograph on my desk, a close-up of the golden ring with its cryptic inscriptions. I ran my finger over the edge of the photo, as if trying to feel the cold, hard stone beneath the image. And I wondered, if that circle was truly meant to keep something at bay, why had it failed? Had McFinn's project gone horribly wrong? Or worse, was someone unleashing what that circle was meant to contain? Every investigation since then has been laden with those questions. There were brief moments in the aftermath when I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the glint of a wolf's eyes in the darkened alley. I spoke about it in hushed tones with Ramirez on our late-night drives home. He'd always say, maybe some things are just better left alone, and I couldn't disagree. We eventually managed to secure a few arrests, low-level affiliates who claimed they'd been involved in vaguely defined rituals connected to the Northwest Passage project. But deep down, I knew the heart of the mystery was still out there. The real force behind those monstrous, wolf-esque killings had never been found. In a city as vast and unfathomable as Chicago, where the ancient and the modern collide every day, it wasn't hard to believe that some doors were never fully closed.